The marble under my palms was cold enough to feel it in my chest, and the chandelier overhead threw little sparks of gold across everything it touched. The woman behind the desk slid a single keycard toward us, warm and shining, and smiled the way people smile at couples. One sweet, just as booked. "Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Bellamy." The ring on my finger was a size too loose. Cora's hand found my sleeve and held on. She paid me to pretend we were married. Then the hotel gave us only one room. I looked at that single gold card and felt the whole careful lie tighten around one small word, one. "My name's Desmond Ellison, and I'm 34 years old. I fix pianos for a living now. There was a time people thought I'd do something bigger with them, that I'd fill concert halls, that my hands were the kind that came along once in a while. I used to play like the right song at the right moment could reach into a person's chest and hold together something that was coming apart. I believed that, for a while. Then life did the quiet work it does on all of us, and I came back down to the keys one at a time, tuning them instead of playing them. The man who taught me most was named Sol Rivers. He owned a narrow little club called Marrow and Vine, down where the city forgets to be loud, and he gave me a stage when nobody else would. When Sol died 2 years ago, something in me folded up and got put away. I stopped chasing the big rooms. I opened a small shop. I learned to be patient with old instruments, and on Friday nights I still played soft sets in the corner of his club, for whoever happened to be listening. It was enough. Most days I told myself it was enough, and most days I almost believed it. I lived alone by then. I'd been married once, to a woman named Vanessa, back when the lights were still on me and the future looked like a straight road. When the money thinned and the applause got farther apart, she found the door. We had no children. Nothing to divide but the furniture and the years. The divorce went through quietly, the way most endings do when there's no one left to fight for it. I didn't hate her. I just stopped expecting anyone to stay. So I wasn't looking for anything. The afternoon the door chime rang and she walked in. The shop smelled like it always did, cold coffee, going stale in the pot, the dry felt smell of hammers under an open lid, a little dust and old wood. I had my hands inside a 100-year-old upright, coaxing a stuck key back to life, when I looked up and saw her standing near the front, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be there. She was dressed too well for my corner of the world. Dark hair, quiet eyes, a coat that cost more than my rent. She looked at the pianos the way some people look at churches. "Are you Desmond?" she asked. I wiped my hands and said I was. She told me her name was Cora Bellamy, and then she said the strangest thing anyone had ever said to me across that workbench. "I need to hire you," she said, "to be my husband. For one weekend." I waited for the joke. It didn't come. She stood there, calm and serious, and told me there was an event she had to attend, a whole weekend of it, and she needed a man beside her who could pass for a husband, someone steady, someone who wouldn't crack in a room full of important people. She'd pay me well. She said the number like she was apologizing for it, and it was enough money to keep the shop breathing through a hard winter, which she couldn't have known, but which I felt in my gut the second she said it. "Why me?" I asked. "You don't know me." "That's exactly why," she said. "You're calm. And nobody in my world knows you. You're perfect for this." It was a clean answer. Too clean, maybe. It slid out of her like she'd practiced it in the car, but there was something underneath it I couldn't name. The way her eyes stayed on me a half-second longer than the words needed. The way she'd walked into a piano shop, of all places, to find a stranger to marry for a weekend. She could have called an agency. She could have hired an actor. Instead, she'd come here, to me. I should have told her to find someone else, that I fixed pianos and played Friday nights and kept to myself, and that pretending to love a woman I'd just met was not a thing a man like me did. She slid an envelope across the bench. "One weekend," she said again, softer. "You'll be my husband. I'll pay you." I should have laughed. I didn't. We had 3 weeks to become a marriage. That was how she put it the first night we sat down to work. 3 weeks to build something a whole room of strangers would believe on sight. She came to the shop after closing, and we sat at the workbench with 2 mugs between us, and she taught me how to be her husband the way you'd teach someone a song, slowly, note by note. She told me the small things first, because she said the small things were what people believed. How she took her tea strong, a little too much honey, never milk, that she read the last page of a book before the first, that she hummed when she was nervous and went completely still when she was afraid, which were, she said, two different things I'd need to learn to tell apart. I wrote none of it down. I found I didn't have to. Something about the way she offered these pieces of herself made them easy to hold. Then came the harder things. Her family. She had a father she spoke about carefully, the way you handle something still warm, Arthur Bellamy. He'd built something with his life, a foundation, she called it. Though she said the word like it weighed more than it should, and he'd died in the fall, only a few months back, and left her holding all of it. There was a board of people who watched her now, she said, watched to see whether she was steady enough, settled enough, to be trusted with what her father had made. That was the weekend we were preparing for. A gala. A room full of people deciding, without ever saying so, whether she was enough. And a husband makes me enough, she said, with a small, tired smile that didn't reach her eyes. Does it? I said. It shouldn't, she said. But it does. To them. I didn't push. It wasn't my place to push. I was hired help. And I knew the shape of that. But sitting across from her in the dark shop, watching her wrap both hands around a mug like she was cold from the inside, I started to see something I hadn't expected to see. Not a client. A person. Quiet. And honest in a way that seemed to cost her something. And lonelier than a woman that put together had any right to be. We practiced the story of us. Where we'd met a bookstore, we decided. Because it was soft and forgettable, and easy to remember. How long we'd been together. What I did, which we agreed to keep simple. She never made me lie big. She built our fiction out of true things rearranged, and I noticed that about her, the way she reached for what was real, even when she was making something up. She'd ask me a question about myself, and then go quiet, and actually listen to the answer, which is rarer in people than you'd think, and I caught myself looking forward to those nights in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in a long time. She was good at the practice, and I started to understand why. She'd spent her whole life performing a version of herself for rooms that were watching. So playing a role came naturally to her. The difference now was that the role let her be softer than her real life allowed. One night she quizzed me on her father's favorite things, and I got 3 of them right without her having told me, just from the way she'd described him. And she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You pay attention." She said it like it surprised her. Like it had been a while since anyone had. Another night, we ran out of things to rehearse an hour early, and just talked. About nothing. About soul and about her mother, and about the way old pianos hold the weather in them. And when she finally looked at the clock, she seemed almost sorry to go. There was a rhythm to those 3 weeks that I came to depend on more than I let myself admit. I'd close the shop, and then the chime would ring and she'd be there. And the whole day would rearrange itself around the fact of her sitting across from me. I told myself it was the work, but I'd started cleaning the good mugs before she came, and leaving a piece half repaired on the bench, so she'd have something to watch my hands do, and a man doesn't do that for a job. He does it for a person. I just wasn't ready to know that yet. One of those nights, I don't know why, I told her about Vanessa. It came out sideways, the way old wounds do. I told her I'd been married, that it had ended when the money got quiet, that my wife had been the kind of woman who filled every room she walked into and left it colder when she left. Loud, I said. And I hadn't meant it unkindly, only true. Cora listened without a word. She didn't fix it or soften it. She just let it sit there between us. And then she said, "She sounds like a lot of the people I grew up around," and something in the way she said it told me she'd spent her whole life being the quiet one in loud rooms. I didn't know then how close those two worlds already were. I didn't know a name I'd just said out loud was waiting for me at the end of that weekend. You never do. The ring came on the last night before we left. She took it out of her coat pocket wrapped in a scrap of cloth, unwrapped it slowly, and held it out to me across the bench. A plain gold band, nothing showy. I reached for it, but she stopped my hand, and then carefully, like it mattered, she slid it onto my finger herself. Her fingers were cool. The metal was cool too, at first, and then it wasn't. warming against my skin until I couldn't feel where it ended. It sat a little loose, a half size too big, and she frowned at that like it was a problem she should have solved. "It'll do," she said. I turned my hand under the shop's one good lamp, and that was when I saw it. The band wasn't new. It held the faint soft scratches a ring earns from years of being kept close, carried in a pocket, turned by a thumb, and inside, along the curve of it, there were letters, tiny ones, engraved. I couldn't read them in that light, just the ghost of writing, the fact that something was there at all. "What does it say?" I asked. She looked at the ring on my hand, and for just a second, something moved across her face, quick as weather over water. Then it was gone. "Nothing," she said. "It came like that. It hadn't. I know that now. I know exactly what it said, and exactly who put it there, and exactly how long she'd carried it before she ever slid it onto the hand of a man she'd hired. But that night I was just a man in a piano shop with a too-loose ring, and a woman who wouldn't quite meet my eyes, and I let it go, because letting things go was the only kind of kindness I had left. "Okay," I said. "It came like that." She smiled then, small and real, the first fully real thing I'd seen from her. Rain had started against the shop windows, and somewhere behind us the old upright I'd been fixing ticked as it settled into itself. She wrapped her hands around her cooling tea, and for a while neither of us said anything, and the quiet was the good kind, the kind you don't need to fill. "Thank you," she said finally, "for doing this. I know how it sounds. It sounds like a woman who's out of other options," I said. She looked at me a long moment. "No," she said softly. "It isn't that," and I thought she meant she had other options and had chosen me anyway, for the reasons she'd given. Calm, a stranger, safe. I turned the ring on my finger and felt the little edge of those hidden letters press against my skin, and I understood nothing about what was really happening in my own shop, in my own hand, 3 weeks into a marriage that hadn't started, and a love I hadn't noticed had been aimed at me for years. The Ashford rose up out of the city like something built to make you feel small in a nice way. Marble floors, a ceiling you had to lean back to take in, chandeliers dripping light onto everyone below. We walked in as Mr. and Mrs. Bellamy, and I felt the ring on my finger like it was made of something heavier than gold. You already know what happened at the desk. One suite, just as booked. One key card, gold and gleaming, sliding across the stone. Cora's fingers closing on my sleeve. Whatever we'd rehearsed about who we were, we had not rehearsed a single room, and I watched the same math run behind her eyes that was running behind mine. There was no version of the weekend where we admitted the marriage was a fiction to a hotel clerk. So we took the card. We took the room. It was beautiful, and it was small in all the ways that mattered. One bed, wide as a field. A couch by the window that I claimed with a joke neither of us fully laughed at. We moved around each other that first night like two people learning the edges of a space, her toothbrush by the sink, my jacket over the chair, the strange tenderness of sharing a bathroom mirror with a woman I was being paid to love. She came out in a robe with her hair down, and her face washed clean of the evening, and she looked younger and more real than she had in 3 weeks. And I looked away, because it felt like something I hadn't earned the right to see. "You take the bed," I told her. "I'm fine out here. You're too tall for that couch. I've slept on worse." She didn't argue. She stood there a moment in the lamplight, and something passed between us that had nothing to do with the story we'd built, and then she said goodnight and turned off her side of the room. I lay in the dark listening to a stranger breathe, feeling less like a stranger than I wanted to. I kept turning the ring on my finger. I couldn't stop. Somewhere near the edge of sleep, I caught myself thinking that if this were real, if any of it were real, I would have counted myself a lucky man. Then I told myself to stop thinking it, and lay there a long time not managing to. The next evening was the gala. I'll tell you the first thing I noticed, because it stayed with me before I understood why. In the corner of the ballroom, past the tables and the ice, and the 150 people in their good clothes, there was a piano, a grand, lit up, glossy under the lights. And the moment I saw it, something turned over in my chest, a feeling like walking into a house you lived in as a child and haven't seen since. I didn't have a name for it. I told myself it was just a musician's reflex, the way my kind always finds the instrument in any room. But it wasn't only that. Something about that ballroom, that piano, that particular gold light, sat too close to a memory I couldn't quite reach and couldn't quite let go of, and I stood there a moment too long, half listening for a song I couldn't have named. I didn't get to reach for it. Because that was when I heard my name, my real name, in a voice I'd spent 2 years trying to forget. Desmond? I turned, and there she was. Vanessa. My Vanessa. From another life. In a dress that cost the whole weekend, and a smile I knew too well. On her hand was a ring 3 times the size of the loose band on mine, and on her arm was a man I didn't know yet but would come to Curtis Braddock, all teeth and tailoring, one of the people deciding Cora's fate that very night. Vanessa, I said. It came out level. I still don't know how. Her eyes moved over me. Then over Cora. Then down to my hand. And I watched her put the whole thing together in about 2 seconds. Because whatever else she was, Vanessa was never slow. Well, she said, and her voice found that edge it always found when she'd caught something she could use. Isn't this cozy? She turned to Cora with a bright, terrible warmth. You must be the famous Cora Bellamy. I've heard so much about your husband. A pause, perfectly timed. I used to be married to him. The floor didn't open. It only tilted. Champagne glasses clinked somewhere behind me, and her perfume reached me before the rest of her words landed, sharp and expensive, and exactly as I remembered it, the smell of 1,000 arguments in a marriage that had run out of road. Desmond doesn't have a wife, Vanessa went on, softer now, aimed at Cora alone, though I heard every word. He has a piano shop and a bad year. She glanced down at my ring and let out a small laugh. So what a cute little prop that is. Does the board know their golden girl rented my ex-husband for the weekend? Cora didn't flinch. I have to tell you that, because it mattered more than anything else in that room. She didn't flinch, didn't pale, didn't reach for a lie, but under the edge of the table, where no one else could see, her fingers found mine and held on the way they had at the front desk, like I was the one steady thing in a room built to knock her down. Curtis stepped in then, smooth as glass. He didn't need the details yet. He could smell blood, and that was enough. He began to talk, low and reasonable, about stability, about how a foundation like Arthur's needed steady hands and clear judgment. About how the board would hate to think Cora had been. He searched for the word like it pained him to find it improvising. He was building the case already. Brick by careful brick, that a woman who would rent a husband was a woman who could not be trusted with her father's life's work. He never raised his voice either. The dangerous ones rarely do. They don't have to. They let the room do the shouting for them, a raised eyebrow here, a sympathetic murmur there, until a good and honest person is standing alone in the middle of a crowd that has quietly decided she is a liar. I watched it start to happen. I watched heads tilt toward Vanessa and Curtis. Watched the easy story spread the way. Easy stories always do, faster than a true one, because it asks less of the people repeating it. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years, not since the last time I'd cared enough about anything to be afraid of losing it. And I stood there in a borrowed marriage with my ex-wife's blade at our backs, and a stranger's kindness quietly turning into the ruin of everything Cora loved, feeling my heart knock against my ribs in a rhythm I could never have played if I'd tried. I thought about the money in my bag and how little it suddenly weighed against the look on Cora's face. I thought about walking out and letting them have their scandal, and I knew I wasn't going to. I looked at her hand in mine and understood that the weekend I'd been paid simply to survive had become something else entirely, and that whatever happened next, I was not going to let go of it. For a moment I thought it was over. I could see it happening, the whisper moving table to table, the board's polite faces turning to stone, everything Arthur Bellamy had built, sliding toward men like Curtis because his daughter had been caught borrowing a husband. Vanessa had the match. Curtis had the kindling. All they had to do was let it catch. And then, Cora stood up. She didn't raise her voice. That was the thing about her, she never once raised her voice all night. She stood, and she waited until the nearest tables went quiet, and she told the truth. Not the small ugly version Vanessa was selling. The whole one. She said yes, she'd asked me to come. She said her father had built this foundation to put music into the hands of children who would otherwise never touch it, because he believed a song at the right moment could carry a person through the worst night of their life. And then she told them about her worst night. She was 20, she said. Her mother had just died. She'd come to one of these very galas because she didn't know where else to be, and she'd fallen apart in a hallway, alone, and a young man playing the piano that night had found her there. He hadn't known her name. He'd just sat with her and played the song she couldn't stop humming and told her one thing she'd held onto for 10 years. I felt the room go strange around me. I felt the floor tilt again, that corner piano pulling harder at the edge of my mind, and a cold, impossible thought beginning to take shape that I didn't dare finish. He told me, Cora said, and her voice caught for the first time all night, that the song was for when it gets loud. For when it gets loud in your head. I never forgot it. I never forgot him. She looked at me then, in front of all of them. I spent 10 years wondering what happened to the man who did that. And a few months ago, I found him. He fixes pianos now. He plays on Friday nights for anyone who'll listen, so no, I didn't rent a stranger. I brought the one person who ever proved to me that this, and she opened her hand toward the room, the foundation, all of it, actually works. Nobody spoke. Vanessa's smile had gone somewhere and not come back. Curtis was still holding his glass, and his careful case had turned to sand in his fingers, because you cannot argue that a woman is unfit to run a music foundation while she stands in front of you, being the reason the music foundation exists. The board wasn't looking at a scandal anymore. They were looking at their founder's daughter, and remembering, all at once, what the whole thing had been for. One of the older members, a gray woman who'd known Arthur, reached over and put a hand on Cora's arm, and that small gesture was the sound of the room turning. Curtis felt it turn. You could see it in his shoulders. I don't remember the rest of the gala clearly. I remember Curtis leaving early. I remember Vanessa not saying goodbye, slipping out with the particular stiffness of someone whose knife has been handed back to them clean. I remember Cora's hand in mine, real now, past pretending, and the way she didn't let go of it once for the rest of the night. It was late when we got back to the room, past midnight. Both of us wrung out. She sat on the edge of that wide bed with her shoes off, and I stood by the window turning the ring on my finger the way I'd started doing without noticing, and under the warm little lamp on the nightstand, for the first time, I could actually read the letters inside the band. I read them once to myself, then I read them out loud, because I couldn't hold them silently. For when it gets loud, the room went very quiet. I looked up. Cora's eyes were already filling. You said that to me, she whispered. 10 years ago, in that hallway, and it all came home at once: the corner piano, the déjà vu, the too clean reason she'd walked into my shop, the ring she'd slid onto my hand herself and called a prop that came like that. It hadn't come like that. She'd had my own words engraved into it years before she ever found me again, and then she'd put them back on the hand of the man who first said them and let me wear them without knowing. It was you, I said, in that hallway. That girl was you. It was always you, she said. Every reason I gave you was true. They just weren't the real one. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the way a girl does, not a woman running a foundation. I looked for you for years. The agency that booked that gala had folded, and I told myself it was foolish, that you were probably long gone, married, happy. And then last winter I walked past a little shop with a piano in the window, and there you were, sleeves rolled up over the keys, and I nearly left because I didn't know how to say any of this out loud. So I said the only thing I could pay for instead. I looked down at the ring, my own words on my own hand, kept safe by a woman for 10 years. There was an envelope of money somewhere in my bag. The reason I'd told myself I was here. It had stopped being the reason a long time ago. Maybe it never really had been. You didn't hire a stranger, I said. My voice wasn't steady, and I didn't try to make it. You came back for me. Stay, she said. Just that. Not for the weekend. not for the board. And I did. Here is the part nobody tells you about a lie that turns out to be true. It doesn't announce itself. There's no swell of music, no perfect line. There's just a Tuesday, and then another one, and slowly the pretending you were doing becomes the plainest, truest thing in your life. We didn't rush it. After that weekend we went back to our two separate lives, and for a while we were careful with each other. The way you're careful with something you've dropped once and caught by luck. She had a foundation to steady. I had pianos to fix, but she started coming by the shop again after closing, this time without a script. And I started saving her the last of the good coffee before it went cold. And neither of us called it anything for a long while, because naming it felt like it might scare it off. The board kept the foundation. I want to say that plainly, because it matters. They didn't keep it because Cora had a husband, real or rented. They kept it because when the loudest people in the room tried to make her smaller, she stood up quiet and true and reminded them what her father's whole life had been about. Curtis backed off the way men like him always do once the easy win is gone. Vanessa I never heard from again, and I found that I didn't need to. She had walked into that ballroom to turn the truth into a weapon, and the truth had simply refused to be one. Some things you cannot cut people with, no matter how sharp you hold them. That's a lesson I've turned over many times, since that the loud ones spend their lives believing volume is the same as strength, and it never once is. Spring came. It came the way it does in this city, all at once. Light spilling across the shop floor in the mornings and pooling on the old wood like something poured. Cora took to sitting on the bench beside me while I worked, her tea going lukewarm the way she liked it, telling me about her days. I learned the rest of her the way I'd learned the first small pieces slowly, note by note. How she laughed in the kitchen when she thought no one could hear, a real laugh, nothing like the composed one she wore for rooms. How she still read the last page first. How she went still when she was afraid. And how, more and more, she stopped going still around me. There was a comfort in it I'd stopped believing I'd ever have again. After Sol died, I'd built a small, quiet life with the door mostly shut, and I'd called it peace because I didn't have a better word for it. This was different. This was the door open and someone walking through it on purpose, every day, choosing the walk through again each time. I hadn't known how much I'd been bracing to be left until I finally stopped bracing, and felt how tired the bracing had made me, and how good it was to set it down. We took it in small, ordinary steps, and the ordinariness was the miracle of it. A dinner that wasn't rehearsal. A Saturday spent doing nothing in particular. The first time she fell asleep on my couch with a book open on her chest, still turned to the last page she'd read first out of habit, and I turned off the lamp and let her stay, and understood that I would happily spend the rest of my life keeping the room quiet for this one person. She started leaving things at the shop, a spare sweater, her second favorite mug, a hair tie on the workbench, and every small object she left behind felt like a promise she wasn't ready to say yet, and I collected them the way I'd once collected the pieces of who she was. She told me, one of those evenings, that she'd spent so long being the steady one for everybody else, that she'd forgotten a person could be steady for her. I told her that was the only job I'd ever really been good at, steadying things, and we both laughed, but neither of us was entirely joking. One evening she was in the little back kitchen of the shop, making us something to eat, and I could hear her humming that habit of hers, the one she did when she was happy and didn't know it, and I looked down at the ring I still wore. I'd never taken it off, not once, since the Ashford. And I thought about what it meant to keep wearing a thing that had started its life as a prop. I went and stood in the kitchen doorway. "This ring," I said, and turned it on my finger. "It was never really mine. It was yours. Your words on it. Your 10 years. She turned from the counter, a dish towel in her hands, and waited. "I don't want to give it back," I said. "But I don't want to just keep wearing yours either. I want it to be ours. For real, this time. Not a story we tell a room, not a prop that came like that." I felt like a young man again, clumsy and honest. "I want to earn the engraving." For a second, she didn't say anything, and the old fear crossed her face, the still one, and then she crossed the little kitchen and put her arms around me, and I felt her nod against my chest before she ever said the word, and when she finally said it, It was so quiet I felt it more than heard it. Yes, that was the whole proposal. No knee, no crowd, no speech, just a lukewarm cup of tea, going cold on the counter, and a woman who had waited 10 years to be found, saying yes to the man who'd finally figured out he'd been found the whole time. Later that night, after she'd gone home, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I sat down at the best piano in the shop, a black grand a client had left with me for months, and I found the song, the one from the hallway, the one I'd played for a girl of 20 falling apart in a corridor, whose name I'd forgotten and whose face, it turned out, I never had. My hands remembered it before my head did. They always do. I played it all the way through, in an empty shop. For a woman who wasn't there to hear it, 10 years, and a whole life later. And it didn't sound like grief anymore, the way so much of my music had since Soul died. It sounded like the thing the song had always been trying to say. It sounded like for when it gets loud played, at last, by a man for whom it had finally, gently gone quiet. I still wear the ring. I'm wearing it right now, telling you this. It fits better than it did at the Ashford. I had it sized, finally, so it doesn't sit loose anymore, but I made them leave the letters exactly as they were. Some things you don't improve, you just grow into them. People ask me sometimes, when they hear how it started, whether I feel strange about it, that she paid me, that the whole thing began as a lie. And I've had a long time to think about my answer. She used a true reason to hide a truer one. She needed a husband for a weekend, that part was real. But underneath it was something she'd carried quietly for 10 years. Something she couldn't say straight out, so she wrapped it in a job and an envelope and a stranger's name. The lie was never the love. The love was the truest thing in the room the entire time. The only fake part was the word we agreed to put on it at the start, and we peeled that word off the second we could. She paid me to pretend, but the ring already knew the truth. It had been waiting on my hand for 10 years to be read out loud. So let me leave you with 2 questions tonight. If someone had loved you quietly for 10 years and used one small lie just to finally reach you, would you call that dishonest, or would you call it brave? And have you ever thrown away something real, only because it started out looking fake? If this story got to you, do me a kindness, hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me down in the comments. Would you have stayed for the truth, or walked away from the lie? I'll be reading every single one.